Hello to everyone and welcome. This is Emily Cohen at Faith Trust Institute, and I'm the program coordinator here and glad to have you join us for this webinar on healthy boundaries and social networking in ministry, what you need to know. I'll be moderating the conversation today, and there's just a few things to note about what you are seeing on your screen. If you look to the right side on the panels there, you'll see a chat box that you can use to send me a direct message if you're having any technical problems, and I can help you sort that out. You can just find my name in the drop-down menu and send it over. Below the chat box is a Q&A box, which you can use to ask ML, our presenter, questions during the presentation. We'll have some time at the end to answer questions, but if you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to type them in. And the slides from this presentation will be emailed to you later today, so you don't need to worry about writing down any of the info on your screen. And we are also recording this session to be made available on our website at a later date. So we can go ahead and begin. We have ML Daniel with us today, who is a lawyer in private practice in Seattle and concentrating in employment law. She's an active lay leader in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and received her Master's of Divinity degree in 2011 from Seattle University School of Theology and Ministry. And ML Daniel is also a trainer for Faith Trust Institute. And we're glad to have you with us today, ML. You can go ahead and begin your presentation.
Thank you, Emily. Good morning, everyone, and it's great to be here with you this morning and to talk about healthy boundaries and social networking in ministry. Just so you know, as we get started this morning, that I am open to answering questions as they arise. That tends to prevent me from being the only person that spends the next hour speaking, and that we are actually engaged in a dialogue this morning around the subject of social networking and ministry and the creation of healthy boundaries, the maintaining of healthy boundaries with regards to the same. So please feel free to post your questions either in the chat box or in the Q&A section as they arise. And if there's something you don't understand as we're moving through, please feel free to post that as well. And then I will do my best to try and respond to it as we are moving along. Next slide, please, Emily. On your screen, what you see is a plethora, or just a case, should I say, of a number of social networking sites that are available. Over the last 9 to 10 years, social networking on the internet has exploded. So what I would ask you to do as you're looking at this screen of the possibilities of how you can go about social networking in the virtual arena, in your chat box, if you would indicate how many of these sites you actually recognize, just by number, but whether it's just one, excuse me, if it's two, if it's three, how many of these sites do you actually recognize as social networking sites? This is going to require you to participate. I know that as we look at some of these sites, there's a social networking site for just about everywhere, and for just about every configuration of community. There are those that are dedicated just for churches and faith communities. There are those that you can virtually mimic the brick and mortar world, where you can create yourself an avatar and engage with other avatars and buy property and have a second life. There are those that are devoted just to professional development, to finding lost classmates. The possibilities are endless. It looks like there's just...
Oh, this is Emily. There's a few coming in directly to me in the chat box, and there's numbers ranging from 2 to 6, more on the high end of 6, 5, 3, around that range.
And that seems to be what I've experienced is that we are familiar with a ton of social networking sites, and so the group that's gathered here today is no different than the groups we always encounter, which is that we're always familiar with the variety of social networking sites that are available to us. This creates a natural segue into our next section. Can I have the next slide, Emily? So my question then becomes for you, are you a social network user? And as you see off to the side, there's a poll for you to participate in as to whether or not you're a social network user. So that requires you to check yes or no as to whether or not you are a social network user. So that gives us some idea as to who's present this morning, as to who's engaged in social networking and those who may not be as engaged in social networking.
And this is Emily. I'm seeing on the results coming in that 70% are saying yes and 10% are saying no.
Wow. That's a fairly high percentage, and it sounds like as I think about the surveys that are being taken as to who's networking and who's engaging in social networking, that will be consistent. So the next question then is, if you're a social networker, of those of you who are actually engaged in social networking, how many of you are intentionally using it for networking for ministry? What I found over the last couple of years is that more and more people are moving into social networking as a way of expanding their ministry or enhancing their ministry. And so it'd be interesting to see what the poll results had to say about that this morning, as to how many of you were actually intentionally engaged in social networking for ministry. Emily, do you have numbers for that?
Yes, right now that's about 60-40, 60 being yes, they are using it.
Okay. If we were all sitting in the same room this morning, my next question would be, well, what prompted you to get into social networking for ministry? But because we're not sitting in the same room this morning, if you would like to share that with us in the chat section, that would be marvelous. As we move through this, we'll begin to address some of those things as to what motivated you to get into social networking as an avenue or an enhancement for ministry. And the next slide, please, Emily. So if you've done any type of social networking and you're in ministry, part of the challenge for those of us in ministry is to manage not only our own actions when we're engaged in social networking, but also the expectation of those with whom we are engaging. It's an area that is premised on, because social networking for the most part is premised on a less formal setting, it's an area in which boundaries can be crossed before we realize that boundary has been crossed. And as the virtual is expanding and growing, the reality remains that if we're engaged in ministry, we have to remain mindful of the boundaries between us and those with whom we have been called to minister to.
This is Emily. There's a couple comments coming into the chat box about the last poll question about this here, and people are saying that they're using social networking on a daily basis for ministry. Others are saying that they use social networking in their work as adjudicatory executive to help connect folks with similar interests, and other people are saying that they work with young adults and college students, so it was virtually a requirement to be involved in social networking. Others who are working during summer programs, and most of their staff is engaged in social networking. It helps to keep people informed, and Facebook seems to be the most popular one that's being used.
Fantastic. That's helpful to know, because that too suggests that you are using the tools available to you to reach the people and to meet the people exactly where they are. As we began to look at that, the whole concept behind social networking was designed to be an informal arena, and I suspect that's probably why those of you in youth ministry are finding it as a very youthful ministry with which to do that in, because it does allow you to have that less formal and less structured environment. However, as we move into social networking and what that involves and what that entails, we must also always be mindful of how we are often perceived, or the roles and expectations that those with whom we are serving have as ministers. On your screen, you see the 9 most common roles or expectations of ministers. I would venture to say that many of you have been placed in one of these roles by someone with whom you are serving. And if not one role, probably several of these roles you have been cast in. And just because we have moved into a less formal arena with social networking does not remove the expectations or how those with whom we are serving view us, or the expectations they have around with regards to what we are able to do for them and with them as ministers. So inherent in some of these roles, in these roles that are on the screen, is the ideal of power and authority and status, and that's something that we always have to be mindful of. And as we move into social networking, where the boundaries are not as defined and not as clear, that heightens the responsibility for those of us to be more mindful of how we engage with those who we have been called to serve. And to also be mindful of the fact that it opens the possibility, because there are less defined boundaries, of being misused or abused. And there's an increased potential for harm for those with whom we have chosen to lead in the social networking arena as well, because of the reduced, or the relaxed, should I say, not necessarily reduced, but the relaxed boundaries with how we engage and how we communicate with individuals online. So may I have the next slide, please? So the question then becomes, how do we bring the resources of our roles, our knowledge and experience as faith leaders, to the benefit and not the detriment of our congregants in the rapidly changing arena of technology? Recognizing that inherent in the nature of the work we do, we are tasked with the challenge of being mindful of the boundaries and creating an atmosphere that honors the sacred trust, as opposed to create an environment in which harm is possible. So that's the question that we're looking at this morning with regards to how do we engage social networking, how do we involve it, and how do we make it useful for our ministry, and what are the risks and benefits involved in that, so that we can create an environment in which those whom we are engaging with are protected, or that we're not creating any additional harm by engaging with them in this less formal setting. So our goal, next slide please. So our goal this morning is I suspect we all can agree that our objective and our goal this morning is to maintain, as faith leaders, is to maintain the integrity of the ministry, regardless of where we find ourselves, whether we're in the virtual world or whether we're in the brick and mortar world. Our goal and our objective really is to maintain the integrity. And as faith leaders, we are granted extraordinary access to people's lives by virtue of the position in which we hold. And this is even more so true when we begin to talk about how we handle social networking and how, in the very nature of social networking. I'm sure those of you who are engaged in social networking have discovered that as you communicate with people in these venues, that people tend to be a little bit more free or open with what they disclose or what they share on their Facebook page and what they post on their Facebook page than they may be if they were engaged in a face-to-face conversation. And so part of our responsibility as faith leaders is to be mindful of that and to draw lines and to distinguish where we stop as ministers. So your responsibility to maintain the boundaries and to try and to is increased in the virtual arena. Because the rules in social networking are constantly changing, we always have to be mindful of the role we are standing in. And what I've discovered when I was talking to some young people about their social networking, and they're always on social networking, is that regardless of whether we are in the brick and mortar church and you're a faith community leader, you are always viewed as a faith community leader, whether you are on a social networking site or whether you are in a coffee shop or whether you are in your robe standing in the pulpit. You are always viewed in that same capacity. And so we always must be mindful that just because we are engaging in a less formal setting, that we are always being viewed in that same role. So the next slide, please. So I think we all can agree that there is tremendous benefit and as well as tremendous risk in engaging in social media. Some of the suggestions that or some of the areas that have already been raised as to how you are using it identify some of the benefits, the very grand benefits of social networking, of being able to communicate with young people who are away at college or engage with youth ministry, to provide information to those you are engaging with. It's endless. And truth be told, the benefit and the use for social media really is only limited by our imagination, what we can imagine we can do with that particular information and that particular resource. And so our goal this morning is to assess the risk and the benefits, to make choices which enhance healthy boundaries in ministry, and to recognize the signs of an unhealthy internet use once you've found yourself there. And when we think about how social networking is being used, what comes to mind is when in the early 70s and late 60s, when televangelism first hit the scene, we can look at social networking in much the same way, with the exception that it seems that social networking would be would far exceed what televangelism actually was able to achieve, because you're able to reach so many more people in such a small amount of time. What you post is posted immediately for all the world to see, and so your reach is tremendous with regards to social media and who you can connect with. Next slide, please. So the benefits of social networking are some of the things that you've actually already identified, is that you can communicate and engage with your faith communities. You can engage, there's tremendous groups out there, tremendous opportunity for you to engage in evangelism, Bible study, sermon feedback. You have the immediacy of communication. If you post something and are inquiring about whether or not you can actually schedule a meeting or if people are available, you have the immediacy of that communication available to you. Accessibility, my God. You can hardly go anywhere today and not see someone checking their smartphone to determine what's going on their Facebook page, or checking their email, or engaging in a tweet, or checking a text message. The accessibility to engage in social networking has increased exponentially over the last 7 to 8 years, and so it provides an opportunity for you to have immediate access to whatever group of individuals that you're trying to reach. Individuals have indicated they've used it for pastoral counseling sessions, for announcements and events, gaining insight to the lives of their community members, and as a way of engaging or increasing the potential enhancing face-to-face relationships. In a survey, can I have the next slide, please? In a survey of 1,003 Protestant churches varying in sizes from less than 100 people in weekly meeting, weekly worship, to over 500 individuals in weekly worship conducted by the Lifeway Research Group, it indicated that many people are using social networking much the same way that you've indicated that you're using social networking. I found it interesting that even though we're using social networking in ministry, is that the vast majority of us is using as a means to interact with our own congregation, not necessarily as a means of evangelism or outreach to those that we are not in relationship with, but more in relationship with those that we are already in contact with. So the way for us to interact with our own congregation. That was followed by distributing news and information outbound only. So it wasn't a means for them to communicate and talk back to us, but was a way for us to provide them with information. And then that was followed by interacting with individuals outside of our congregation. So we can see just from the way these numbers, some of these numbers show is that there's tremendous opportunity or potential for using social networking to help us further how we do ministry, whether it's helping us to foster a relationship between our own congregants, managing church groups and ministry, engaging with those outside of our own congregation, or just interacting with our own congregation, is a tremendous way for us to begin to use this tool. I would caution, however, that as we look at how we use this tool and begin to integrate it into our own ministry and the fullness of our ministry, that we are mindful of those who are not engaged in social networks, those who are not on the internet, and those who are not as computer savvy. That might be something that we should be mindful of as we begin to move more fully into using it as a tool for engaging with our community, that we might find that we are leaving some individuals out of that conversation simply because they are not part of that social network. May I have the next slide, please? Also, in a survey conducted by Lifeway Research, it indicated that they surveyed 1,000 pastors using social media, and 46% of the pastors surveyed indicated that Facebook is the most common form of electronic communications with the congregation. That's tremendous that many of us are out there engaging with our congregations in that way, and that 16% of us are blogging and 6% of us are tweeting. And what I discovered is that in my research is that in the 46% of the pastors who were surveyed, or the reason for using Facebook is because that is where they are finding their people are. And as more and more people are or young people, should I say, are leaving the brick and mortar church. More and more ministries are finding their way into Facebook just because that's where that population of students or believers or the congregation has found themselves, or found their way to be. Next slide, please. So, as many of you indicated that you were using Facebook as your primary use of social media outlet or social networking outlet, the numbers stand to reason as to why Facebook is being used. When you have 7 billion minutes per month being used by Facebook users, 500 million users, 250 million log in daily, 150 million using their mobile devices to contact or to connect into the site, and with the average individual having 130 friends, the reach of just one individual to reach 16,900 contacts with one post is tremendous. So it stands to reason that more and more faith leaders are utilizing social networks to reach out not only to their own members, but to foster relationships with those that are unchurched or who identify as spiritual but not necessarily religious. I was doing some research, and in another survey by the Edison Survey Group, it indicated that 51% of Americans and 93% of Americans are 51% of Americans are using Facebook, and 93% of Americans are at least familiar with Facebook. And so Facebook has become a tool with which people are using it for advertisement, are using it for socializing, for ministry, for posting information, for connecting with old friends. It has become a tool that can be extremely useful if used wisely. But it also presents a tremendous amount of risk, which is something that we should not ignore. And what we shouldn't ignore most of all with regards to Facebook, and the numbers stand to support it, is that part of the challenge of social media is the concern about privacy. Now, the next slide is the concern with privacy. One of the things that came out of the research, or the Edison research, was that not very many people are concerned about privacy when it comes to their personal information on Facebook. Out of this entire survey, only 27% of the people were very concerned about privacy issues of their personal information on Facebook. So what this raises for us as faith leaders is that this is the attitude of the laity that we need to understand, who we are social networking with, that they're not as concerned about privacy as we may be concerned about privacy. And as such, that heightens our responsibility as faith leaders to be more concerned about maintaining their privacy. And I would ask you, how many times have you read an exchange or a post on Facebook and wondered if the person or persons who posted the picture or posted the comment or statement, if that's a conversation they would have had in a face-to-face encounter? Or would they have shared as freely as much in a real-world conversation? The challenge with Facebook and the challenge with many social media outlets or social networking outlets is the challenge of anonymity. At least social networking offers to you, or seems to offer, a false sense of anonymity, which also creates that more relaxed atmosphere that we were talking about earlier. But it seems to create that false sense of security, which makes this significant, is that it increases the numbers of being less concerned about the issue of privacy because you feel like you're anonymous. And that anonymity then encourages you to post things and to say things that you probably otherwise would not say. And it also helps to blur where the boundaries are. So when we began to think about the anonymity component of social media and social networking, the issue of privacy then heightens our responsibility exponentially to not only establish but to maintain appropriate boundaries and to foster healthy relationships. And as we're talking about privacy here, it should be clear that anything stated on the social network is neither confidential nor private. And that's something that many people believe is the case, is that there's some privacy in what they post on Facebook, but the reality is that there's nothing confidential or private about what you post on Facebook, so there should not be an expectation of such. And that's our responsibility as faith leaders to really begin to help those with whom we are engaging with to recognize that there is no confidentiality, or then that there is no privacy for what they post on our wall or what we post on theirs. Next slide, please. So as we look at the pictures on the screen, what these pictures depict for me is that in the right left-hand corner, you have the picket fence. And the picket fence in many regards is like the traditional engagement of ministry that many of us are familiar with, where there are some clearly defined boundaries as to where the pitfalls are. You have a delineation as to what's not to be crossed and where we can cross over. And they're more clearly defined. But the picture on the right, upper left-hand corner, however, shows, in my opinion, is more like what we're experiencing in the virtual arena, is that there really are no boundaries, and we are trying to find our way as to where the boundaries are, because there's such an undefined space and an undefined field as it currently stands, primarily because it's a world of possibility, and in many respects it's like the picture, as the possibilities are endless as to where we can go and how we can use this particular tool. So it becomes important to ask the critical questions that will contribute to creating a safe environment for those that had entrusted us with their leadership before we wade into social media and social networking. So as we look at the pictures, one of the things that comes to mind is the question at the top of social media and social networking, the picture where there really are no defined boundaries. Some of the questions we ought to be asking ourselves is, what is our objective with regards to using it as a ministerial tool? Who are we attempting to reach? Who is the audience that I am most likely to encounter? What is my responsibility to this particular audience? What is my relationship to this audience and to the individuals that I'm engaging with? And how do they see me? And then you should also ask yourself, am I just another one of the group, or do they see me as in their faith leader capacity? Those are just some of the questions we can begin to ask as we begin to attempt to construct some boundaries as we move into an arena that really has no boundaries and that is constantly changing from day to day. And the next slide, please. This cartoon kind of speaks for itself, which is what I like about it when we talk about risk, is that and the dogs are talking to each other, and one's at the computer, and it says on the internet, nobody knows you're a dog. Regardless of how you answer the questions that I just indicated, this cartoon says this cartoon drives home the idea that because of the anonymity aspect of social media, we never are quite clear as to who we are engaging with. And that's the challenge of social media and social networking, is that people can be whomever they choose to be. They can create a persona, and they can present themselves as they desire to be viewed. So you can never be sure with whom you are communicating. Thus, it's worth always being clear in your policies that the organization cannot guarantee the safety of individuals who choose to participate in the network. You might also consider if you're putting together a network for your organization or for your community, that you indicate in your policy that there's been no screening done. So you have no way of knowing who's engaging in the network and who they're talking to, and that people should be aware of that. And so essentially it's play at your own risk. So while Facebook is designed by its environment where individuals are self-disclosing by pictures and education, location, interest, it still poses the quality of affording users anonymity, or the ability to create a persona of their own, which is what I just indicated. And so while it's a disclosing type environment, you still get to be who you say you want to be. And so the onus really is on us faith leaders to maintain a ministerial integrity and to try to protect the vulnerable as we engage with them in this arena. And so who fits into the category of the vulnerable for those of us in faith ministry? I would venture to say those of us in faith in ministry, the vulnerable would be our congregants, elderly, students, employees. All the people, truth be told, that are on your network could conceptually be considered part of the vulnerable. So the best test question, or a good test question for social networking is, when you're considering social networking, next slide please, is when I'm considering to relaxing the boundaries, what is the likely impact on or the potential harm to the individual in my congregation, the congregation itself, or our shared ministry? And part of when you're looking at these questions and these test questions, you may also ask yourself, are you creating a potential hazard of creating friendships within your community? Is that a concern? Where you're blurring the lines between the congregant and the faith leader and creating potential friendships? Are you creating some type of dual relationship? Is your engagement on this level of social networking creating a barrier for your own self-care because you're available to your parishioners in that way? Another question would also be, are you always in ministerial mode because you're always available, be it either on your phone, Facebooking, tweeting, texting? Are you always in ministerial mode? Next question, please. Next slide. When I think about how we live our lives today, some 8 or 10 years ago, not many of us were engaged in social networking, and not many of us were PMing or texting or any of that stuff. And so when we look at this cartoon where she encourages him to have a good vacation and enjoy your vacation, he goes on and says, "Thanks, Jan. Hey, if anyone needs me, they can just hit my cell or PM me on Facebook or what the hell. Just write me right on my wall since I'll be checking it, or you can DM me on Twitter or IM me on IM at night, or I'll be Xboxing so you can message me there too. Short of that, I want to be left the hell alone and get some much needed rest." I don't know how many of you can relate to that. I suspect many of us can relate to that we are always available in some form or fashion because of the technology has made it such that we can always be in communication and in touch with those we are working with. So the question then becomes for you, when you find that you're using this social media and the social networking, how do you know when you have crossed over into an unhealthy territory? What kind of expectation does this set up for you that you are always accessible? And that's the question that you really should begin to spend some time with, is when you are always accessible to your parishioners, what type of expectation does that set up for your parishioners? And how does it do? What kind of model are you setting for your parishioners with regards to a balanced life, your value of family time, how you prioritize your work and your self-care? What type of message is that sending to the individuals you are working with? There's a cartoon on the web where there's a priest who's speaking to a congregant in a confessional, and the congregant is sharing his confession with the priest, and the priest responds to him, "Well, do you have anything else fresh? I've read that on your Facebook page already." That kind of begs the question as to what do you do with information when you have congregants who are sharing information on Facebook or in their social media or tweeting? What do you do when you come across information that you've acquired this way, and how do you respond to it? And are you obligated to respond to it when you've encountered it in this arena? So those are questions that we don't necessarily have answers to, but they're questions that you should consider as you are looking at how you engage in social networking and social media. So what do you do with that information? If you come across it indirectly, if someone else posts information about someone else, if you come across it indirectly, are you at liberty to discuss it or raise it with them in the brick and mortar world? Where's the line? It's the question that these particular cartoons are really raising, is where's the line in your social media relationship, in your social networking relationship? Next slide, please.
Before the next slide, there's one comment from someone that says another challenge is that parishioners tend to expect us to respond to their pastoral needs because they posted things on Facebook. So there's an expectation that you'll be checking it and responding in a pastoral way.
And that's also one of the risks. You are absolutely correct in that. That's also one of the risks, is that when you have established a relationship where individuals are comfortable with posting their concerns or posting their prayer requests, and you fail to respond, you are absolutely correct that sets up an expectation that you will be checking it, and that somebody is monitoring, and that somebody is indeed following up with it. And how do you handle that when they begin to realize that nobody is checking it as they had anticipated and that you have not responded? So you're absolutely correct with respect to that. The parishioners do have an expectation that you will respond to, even if they didn't post it directly to you, that you read it somewhere because you're part of that network and that you were informed about their need or their concern. And so that is something that we ought to be concerned about as to how we handle our network. That also raises the question of, as you began to create networks, if you created a network of followers or friends, as they're called on Facebook, that also includes your congregants as well as your own individual personal friends, how do you then begin to separate individuals in your congregation who you have not friended? And that's something else that you might also want to consider is what kind of message does that send if there are congregants who you have not friended and there are congregants on your friend list. So that creates its own sense of a division of how you began to negotiate and maneuver in that situation. Next slide. So part of the question here, part of the challenge for us is self-assessment in ministry. And as you see on the slide, it says how much time each week do you spend using social networking for ministry? And I'm not even going to begin to ask you to post in the chat section how much time you actually spend using social networking for ministry, because I know it probably varies from week to week, and depending on what the circumstances are, will dictate how much time you're actually spending on social networking for ministry. But it's part of the self-assessment question that you should be asking yourself is, how much time am I actually devoting to this particular tool for ministry? And then once you've assessed that, you also get a chance to determine, okay, when I compare that to how much time I'm spending in face-to-face ministry, does it add up? And does it balance? And then you begin to ask yourself, okay, if I'm using this much time for social networking for ministry and I'm engaged in face-to-face ministry, how much time each week am I spending in face-to-face social interaction with family and friends? That's the self-care piece, that we don't always want to be so available to our parishioners and our congregants that we fail to take care of ourselves and we fail to engage with those immediately in our presence in a face-to-face interaction with our family and our friends. The also self-assessment question that you might want to consider asking yourself is, are you neglecting other areas of ministry because of your time online? And the question that I like as part of the self-assessment in ministry is, are you lurking instead of engaging? I don't know about you, but many of us on Facebook who have a number of friends on Facebook, there's no way for you to totally engage with everybody on your Facebook page. If you have more than 130 friends, which is what they're suggesting the average individual on Facebook has, if you have more than 130 friends, there's really no way for you to engage individually with all 130 of those individuals, let alone those who have more than 130 people on their Facebook friend list. So the question then becomes, are you lurking? Are you just checking in and gathering information on those people who are in your congregation, who are your friends, and you're not really using it as a means of engaging and enhancing a brick and mortar or a real world relationship? Are you just lurking, is what it's called. So those are the questions that I would ask or begin to ask as you are assessing how you're using social networking in ministry, especially the lurking question, because then people are, you never want to be accused of just signing people on and not engaging in a relationship with them. And people really are looking for a relationship. As much as social networking encourages a more relaxed atmosphere, it really is geared towards relationship. And there's a tremendous possibility of generating and creating relationships and keeping people informed and engaging with people's lives in a social networking arena. And so I would encourage you, as you're looking at how you use social networking, that you really begin to engage if you're not engaging and encouraging people and responding to birthdays and asking questions and getting them to respond to you for questions. Begin to engage with them so that it enhances and enriches the face-to-face relationship that you may have with that particular individual. Next slide, please. So then that moves us nicely into policy considerations and critical questions. And I'm not going to read them all to you, but I'm going to highlight just the things that are bolded Because these are all things, these critical questions that we as faith communities ought to be asking ourselves. And if you don't have a church policy, you really should have a church policy with regards to social networking use and internet use. And you really should, that process really should start with what is your purpose in using that specific technology. And we talked about this briefly earlier on one of the other slides as to what's your purpose and why are you using that particular technology. And so you should be clear, your organization should be clear as to what your objective is in using that technology. If it's just a place for folks to gather and socialize, be clear as to that's the purpose for it. If it's intended as a means for evangelizing, be clear as to that's what your objective is, because then that will determine how you go about inviting people to join that social network, who gets to join that social network, the rules for that particular social network, and the do's and don'ts of that, and the code of conduct on that particular network site. And so what is your purpose for using that specific technology is always important in establishing your policy. It drives what goes into your policy, ultimately speaking. Next slide, please. Also, you may ask yourself, one of the key questions is how can you ensure transparency in your usage of the technology? And part of that really is if you have a social networking policy, the question should be whether or not you should ask yourself the question, first of all, is your congregation aware of your policy? If your congregation is aware of your policy, that goes a long way to helping you to be able to maintain and to maintain the boundaries that we've been talking about earlier, to create the boundaries that we were talking about earlier, because if they are aware of what the boundaries are, your objective with regards to that particular network, it helps them to understand some of the concerns and some of the actions you take with regards to boundaries, or your inability to respond to posts that are on the site, or your unwillingness to respond to posts that may be on the site, or why certain posts come down. But it helps you to be able to maintain those boundaries that we've been talking about from a ministerial standpoint. Also, you can help to ensure transparency by being clear in your policy as to who the policy covers. It should be clearly stated as to who the policy covers, whether it covers just the pastoral staff, does it cover employees of the congregation, does it cover volunteers. The policy should be extremely clear as to who is covered in the policy, and that helps to also ensure your transparency of your usage. It also will be helpful when we begin to talk about transparency of usage if you have some type of code of conduct for that particular network. That way individuals who are engaged in that network have a full understanding as to what's expected of them with regards to posts, who has the last say as to what's going to be posted or whether or not a post can remain on the site. So any and all parties affected by the policy should be identified in the policy. There might also be a way for transparency to ensure transparency also is that all parties affected by the policy have some kind of requirement to sign an acknowledgement that they have read, understood, and agreed to the terms of the policy. That's an indication on their part that they are aware of what's expected of them with regards to social networking, what the organization expects of them with regards to social networking, and what they can expect of the organization in response to that. So it's clear as to what your expectations are of the individuals, and the individuals is clear as to what the organization can expect, what they can expect from the organization in response as well. And it also should probably state, transparency also should state some of the consequences of failing to adhere. So clarity is everything, and if you can, the clearer you can be in your policies, the better, more effective your policy will be, the clearer you can be. Next slide, please. Along that same line, as we talk about who the policy covers and the clarity and the transparency of that policy, is someone in your organization supervising and monitoring the content of social networking sites. That's essential. I can't state that enough, that someone in the organization should be monitoring and supervising the content of social networking sites. They should be monitoring the individuals who have been assigned to work as moderator of those sites. someone should be making sure that the sites are running according to the code of conduct or the policies that are in place with regards to the organization's expectations for social networking. Preferably, it should be someone in senior ministry that's doing the supervising and monitoring of the content of the social site, that gives some oversight to those who are engaged in the actual day-to-day process itself.
And Imelda, there was a question from someone about this topic on congregations having their own fan page or their own personal page on Facebook, and if you know of any specific risks that are associated with that, or what's some of the tips you have for running that well.
Fan pages are slightly different than the individual pages, because fan pages have the possibility of allowing you to have two-way communication. And so I think the challenge of fan pages is that you structure it in such a way that you can control the content. And I think that's the key of fan pages, is that you structure whether or not the individuals are posting on the site or have the ability to post on the site, or whether or not they just have the ability to read what's being posted on the site. I guess I would need more clarity as to how the individual is using the fan page, because that makes a difference as to how you're using the fan page. And if in fact you're using it as a means of having two-way communication, where individuals get to engage not only with the moderator of that particular site, but get to engage with one another, then in many respects that's not much different than an individual page. However, if we're using it as a closed fan page, where it's controlled as to who have access to it, that's slightly different. And I think there are enough privacy provisions that you can work into those fan pages that they can really work for you if you are an organization trying to control, like you're using it for a youth ministry, and you can control who has access to that particular fan page. In any instance, what I would encourage, whether you're using it for your individual ministry or you're using it as a fan page, I would also encourage, I know Facebook has a new mechanism where you can make your friend list unavailable. And I would encourage any organization to make their friends list unavailable, so that when people tap onto their site, they could not see that they don't get a chance to see the entire friend list or the entire fan list. That way, that it doesn't open other people up to exposure from anybody who happens by that fan page and just can look at your friend list and communicate with whoever's on there. And so that's one more layer of protection that you can offer to those people that you are engaged with, is that your friend list is not accessible to everybody.
And they have clarified that they are using their fan page as a marketing tool for their congregation.
Right.
And then, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just that was a clarification. And then there's another question on the similar topic. Someone said that they serve as an administrator for 2 closed Facebook groups, and how confidential are those postings in those groups?
My caution on any social media is that confidential is never confidential, and private is never private. All that's ever posted on the internet is always posted on the internet forever. There are always sites that you can go back and recreate a site, even if you've taken the site down. There's software that can go back and recreate that site and pull it back up in its form as it was when it was active. And so what happens in those sites what's confidential is never confidential. And so I would always move with that as an awareness that confidentiality in the virtual arena isn't as confidentiality as we understand it in the or real world. And so that would always be my caution, whether it's a closed site or an open site. I think in a closed site you probably have a little bit more control with regards to the conversation that takes place, because of people having to be invited in. But once something is posted, you really have no control as to what people do with it once it's posted. You have no control as to how they repost that. You have no control as to how they cut and paste that and where it goes once you posted it. And so that's always the challenge when you're talking about social media, is that once it's on the site, you really have no control as to how it's used after that. Next slide, please. So as as we move on further down, does your policy clearly define who may be a member of the organization's sponsored network? And I think we briefly talked about that in the past. That's the challenge of the beauty of a closed network, is that you really do get to kind of pick and choose who gets to be part of that network, and you can control that a little bit better. One of the questions that's always intriguing whenever we're doing this training is how is access to volunteers and employees' accounts handled? And that's a question that organizations really should be asking themselves, is how do we handle employees' accounts and volunteers' accounts? Individuals who are volunteering with the organization and they have a Facebook page and they have friended or accepted friend requests from individuals within the ministry group or the congregation, as well as employees. How do you handle those accounts? I think what we should be mindful of with regards to people who are serving in volunteer capacities and employee capacity is to be mindful that they are not speaking for the organization in their individual capacity. To be clear that they are operating in their individual capacity, if in fact that's what's happening, or to be clear that they're operating in their capacity, in their ministerial capacity, in whatever their arena may be. I would encourage across the board, however, that even if you have a personal page and a pastoral page or a ministerial page, two separate pages, that you be mindful of who you invite onto those pages. Because even if you have a personal page that you're not using for ministry, but you have invited some of your congregants onto that page, you have created a ministerial setting. And so that's just something to be mindful of. We get the question all the time, if I have a personal page and a professional page, does that solve my problem? And I'm not as convinced that it solves your problem, especially if you do not have, you're not clear. Especially if you have individuals who are part of your congregation on your personal page. I'm not as convinced that solves your problem when you have bleed over in that fashion. So that's something just to be mindful of. Next slide, please. Does your policy clarify that clergy and lay leaders should not friend members, but only respond? And does your policy encourage separating pastoral Facebook pages? We just talked about that. I guess what I would like to say about this particular slide and the accepting friends as opposed to requesting friends requests is that this is not a loophole. Many people see this as a loophole. This is not a loophole for clergy to suggest to members that they should send them a friend request because it's against the policy for them to friend anybody. This is a spirit of the policy and not the letter of the policy type thing that we're talking about here. Is that it really should not be where we're encouraging people to friend us because we can't extend a friend request. So when we're saying that you can respond to a friend request, but we're not encouraging you to go out and to seek friend requests. So when we're training around, this is a great opportunity when we're talking about volunteers and employees and social networking, and begin to do some training around that. The objective and the principle of the organization are what drive this policy. And this is what's going to drive the adherence to this policy. The effective way of garnering the buy-in is to do some training around it. So when you establish why you're using the technology, what your objective is, adherence to this responding to friends as opposed to requesting friend requests becomes a little bit more easier for people to accept because there's some buy-in as to what the objective of the organization is with regards to this particular site or why you're using this particular technology for social networking. Next slide, please. So some of the questions we talk about for self-assessment, for self-care, is are you neglecting your personal and family relationships? And that's something that is not hard to do if you spend any time online at all, social networking, between checking email, updating your status on your social networking site, tweeting, or any number of other social networking arenas. Especially the reports indicate that the average individual has at least two social networking memberships or accounts, at least two. And so if you're managing your social networking life, it's not hard to get mired down in spending all your time online or social networking. And so you have to always ask yourself, are you neglecting personal and family relationships? Are you always online, or does it appear to your congregants that you're always online? In this day and age where we can be online on our telephone and not really be paying attention to it, but we appear to be online, that may be an issue of concern. Then there's the self-assessment question of, are you engaging in risky online behavior? Are you engaged in chat rooms, texting, anonymous, chatting? Are you engaged in activities that's just not healthy? And how much are you using the internet for recreation? Is also something that you should be asking yourself. Next slide, please. As we're moving towards the end, I want to leave some time for us to have some questions, so I'm going to move through these next slides fairly quickly. There's the potential consequences of overuse or misuse, and some of these are fairly self-explanatory. There's the loss of ministerial integrity, the isolation and withdrawal, depression, loss of time, procrastination, disassociative distancing from embodied relationships and responsibilities, and the breakdown of relationships. All of these are things that are possible when we began to focus only on our social networking life or our virtual life as opposed to our real-time life, are things that are possible. And so just things to be mindful of and to be thinking of as you use and monitor how much time you spend in social networking. Next slide, please. Best practices. So one of the best practices that we always have come up with is and I love this quote, I don't post anything on my Facebook that my bishop or my mother can't see. And I think that's a good rule of thumb. If it's something that you wouldn't want somebody in authority or someone who you highly respect to see, that's always a good rule of thumb. Post nothing that the world can't see, because rest assured that once it's on the internet, the world will see it in some form or fashion. Always remember that Facebook is forever. And we talked about that earlier, that confidentiality is not confidentiality, privacy is not privacy. Just because you erased it doesn't mean it doesn't exist somewhere in some file that can't be pulled back up somewhere later down the road by somebody who's fairly swift with technology. Treat every communication as if it's a public, nothing is confidential or private. I would encourage you not to post photos without people's permission. And I would also encourage you to avoid posting photos of children due to the risk of photos being misused by predators. Oftentimes we want to post our pictures of the children's pageant and things like that, and I would encourage you to refrain from that. That's just because of the ability to really narrow down the location. If we're posting pictures of children, your congregation is located, it has an address, so that at least brings it close to them. And if we're posting pictures of children, then that brings the predator even closer to identifying that particular child. And so it's just something to be mindful of as we post pictures of children. Other people are posting pictures of children, that's one thing, if they're posting their own children. But I would encourage us as faith leaders to try and avoid that. Next slide, please. A good rule of thumb also is to consider providing every accepted friend request on your organizational site with an electric copy of the site's code of conduct. And that goes a long way of helping to try and control the post on that site, setting the tone of that particular site so that everybody understands what the rules of the road are for engaging in that particular network. Take a technology Sabbath for a day every week. That sounds difficult to do. I know I found that difficult to do, to take some time away from electronics, given that it's such an integral part of our day-to-day life. But it's something that we all should consider doing, is disconnecting from the electronics at least once a week. Avoid being online before going to sleep. I suspect whatever you're going to encounter before you go to sleep at night, time will be waiting for you in the morning, and so it's not something that we need to be mindful of or conscious of as we're headed off to bed at night, to check our email or to check our Facebook page or to check that last tweet to see who's contacting us. And always be mindful that balance really is the key to this particular technology. It's a great technology to be used, and it can be used for enhancements, for marketing, and for ministry. But balance really is the key, so that you don't find all your time being used in the virtual arena as opposed to balancing it with how much time you're actually engaged in face-to-face relationships. Next slide, please. So as we close out, it's a matter of stewardship. It really is a matter of using the resources available to us wisely so that we can serve those we are being called up to serve. And so it really is a matter of stewardship. And if you begin to look at social media and social networking as stewardship, how do I best handle the resource available to me? How do I honor the resource available to me? How do I balance that so that it's used most effectively in ministry? That's a great way to begin to think about how you use it and why you use it and for what purposes you're going to use it for. If you begin to look at it as a way of stewardship, it's yet one more resource in our tool for ministry to reach individuals in ministry. Next slide, please. And so there's some resources that are available to you. I would highlight, if you're looking for a social media policy, I would commend to you the United Church of Christ Connecticut Conference. They've done a fair amount of work on social networking and social media, and they have a social media policy on their website that's worth taking a look at. I will encourage you, however, as you look at other conferences and other organizations, faith-based organizations, media policy, that you use it as a place to start, not a place to finish, because every policy really should be unique to the organization and the community that it is seeking to serve and seeking to address. I would also encourage you to take a look on Faith Trust Institute's website. There are a couple of articles that Marie and I have authored that give way more in-depth information about the social networking and healthy boundaries, what critical questions you should be asking as you're framing your organization's policy and you're framing your social medias and your social networking, things you really should be thinking about and questions you should be answering as you wade in that you have answers to, so that you don't find yourself in the middle of something having not considered it. So at this point, I'd like to open it up for questions if there are any more questions. We have a little bit more time left where I can actually answer your questions if there are questions from the community.
There was one question which you already answered about if there would be a sample policy that you could provide or places to start. And then there was another question about any examples of creative or really successful ways to use social networking as people are trying to figure out exactly how much time and energy to put into their Facebook page or other sites. If you have any success stories.
What I would encourage you to, as I was preparing for this morning, what I would encourage you to consider is to Google social networking and ministry, and there's a ton of information out there for social networking and ministry, and there's a tremendous amount of blogs out there where individuals have done some really good work. Some of the work that they've done is pretty impressive, exploring using it creatively for ministry, using it creatively for marketing, using it creatively for evangelizing. So some of the stuff it's worth spending some time looking to see how other individuals are actually using social media and social networking. And so I don't have any particular site in mind that I can send you to who I think are doing it well. But there's a plethora of information out there for every aspect of ministry that you're looking to do. If you're looking to really bolster how you use your website or how you use your networking page as outreach, there's individuals out there who have wonderful suggestions as to how to go about doing that. And there's statistical information out there with regards to the most effective way to use it, what's not effective, and what individuals have not found to be successful. And so I would encourage you to spend a little bit of time just really doing the research piece. And I guess that's part of the question and answering piece of the critical question that you ask yourself is how much research have you done going into it to determine whether or not you're going to get the results you're seeking based on what's already been done. And there's a tremendous amount of research out there because more and more faith communities are using it, more and more research is being done in this area with regards to where people are tapping in, which ones are being used most, and how effective they actually are. So I would encourage you to do a little bit of research in that arena. There's a tremendous amount of information out there for you to resource and to use.
Great. And those are all the questions that we have at the moment.
Fantastic.
Did you have any final words, Emma?
I just would encourage individuals that what we did this morning was just the tip of the iceberg, and it's always difficult to try and get that much information in an hour. So if there's information or questions that you find that you have, please feel free to contact Faith Trust Institute. We are more than willing to begin to work with you in this regard and to work with you with regards to crafting policies and procedures and things that go along that line to help you to create a healthy ministry that's expanding into this arena, because it's a media that's going to be used and that we're going to find being used more often in ministry, and better for us to do it well than not to do it at all, and better for us to do it well than to do it poorly. And so if you'd like to contact us, feel free to give us a phone call, feel free to send us an email, and we would be more than glad to work with you in that regard. And we are available for consultations and for assisting you in helping to begin to craft those policies if, in fact, that's where you'd like to go ultimately. And so we encourage you to use the technology. If you've heard nothing else today, I say use the technology, but also be mindful and be sure to be asking the right questions as you're using the technology.
Great. Thanks so much, Emma, for your presentation today and for guiding us through the topic. I know there's a lot of information and a lot of possibilities, so we're glad to have you begin the process and conversation around healthy boundaries. As I said at the beginning of the presentation, I'll be emailing everyone the slides from Emma's PowerPoint so that you can have access to the links and the information that she shared. To see a list of upcoming webinars, or if you'd like any information on training materials or to be in touch with us about your policies, you can email me, which you'll have my email address later today from sending the slides, and you can visit our website also to find contact information. So many thanks again to everyone for being here today, and this concludes the presentation. Take care.